Okay, hi everybody. Well, I want to talk about something now and centre on something that happened back in August of 2016. If you can cast your mind back that far, if the hazes of New Year's Eve have passed sufficiently by now. And I want to talk about, you may remember at the University of Chicago, the Dean, specifically the Dean of Students in the College is his title, John Ellison, had written to the new incoming classes of students to give some rather robust and forthright views on safe spaces, trigger warnings, and of the cancelling of speakers on university campuses. Now, the reason that I'm putting this together now and not back then is primarily because it fits in with a video that I put out a couple of weeks ago, Safe Spaces from Good Intentions to Intellectual Cancer. But the other reason that I particularly want to focus on this is because there's a couple of interesting points, I think, that I'd like to make on this that I didn't hear anybody else make. I'm sure somebody somewhere made these points, but I haven't read them and I haven't heard them. So I wanted to chime in on this particular thing. To refresh your memory then, a letter was written by John Ellison, the Dean of Students in the college. And let me read you a little bit of that because I've got it written down here. Okay, members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge and learn without fear of censorship. Civility and mutual respect are vital to all of us, and freedom of expression does not mean the freedom to harass or threaten others. You will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion and even disagreement. At times this may challenge you and even cause discomfort. And we get to the kind of drum roll moment here. Our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial. And we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own. He is taking in that letter a very, very hard line, and you can compare the kind of tack that he is taking there, kind of where he's trying to position the University of Chicago from where a number of other universities have positioned themselves on some of these issues. Now, there was a little bit of kickback with regard to this. A letter was co-signed by 150 members of faculty. As a result of it, I'll read you one paragraph from that. I have it written down here. Those of us who have signed this letter have a variety of opinions about requests for trigger warnings and safe spaces. We may also disagree as to whether free speech is ever legitimately interrupted by concrete pressures of the political. That is as it should be. But let there be no mistake, such requests often touch on substantive ongoing issues of bias, intolerance and trauma that affect our intellectual exchanges. To start a conversation by declaring that such requests are not worth making is an affront to the basic principles of liberal education and participatory democracy. Okay, so there's obviously a little bit of difference of opinion on there, as there is on a lot of these other campuses that have took a different tack. It's perhaps more refreshing than on this kind of campus that the people that took the other tack felt more at liberty to express their opinions without fear of serious repercussions, but that's a separate issue to what I want to talk about. What I'm interested in is this kind of robust stance that the University of Chicago is positioning itself with regard to this. And there's two main points that I want to make with regard to that. But before I get on to those main points, I maybe ought to comment on where I position myself with regard to the Dean's letter and regard to this response letter, which is that personally, although I have much sympathy for the Dean's letter, I think it is a little bit too over the top, and I can see why a letter was made in response to it. Because some of these things, I think, with regard to speakers on campus and not dismissing speakers on campus, I'm entirely in agreement. But when it comes to things such as trigger warnings, I think that it's a little bit over the top just to say that on no circumstances will trigger warnings be issued. I can tell you from my personal experience that I joined the fire service 21 years ago now. You can imagine 21 years ago that it was a pretty robust environment when you were training to be a firefighter at the time. It was one of those kinds of environments where you expected on a daily basis to be shouted at and to be intimidated, I suppose, verbally and you expected to be given punishment tasks if you did something that was severely not up to spec, or you were lazy in some kind of capacity. It was a much harsher environment than you would expect in a university, and yet we got trigger warnings in that environment. Nobody stood there and went, whoa, trigger warning. But when we were going to be showed something that was especially shocking, especially gruesome, perhaps I remember one picture of a guy who a wall had collapsed on him so that it had concertinaed his body together and crushed and broken his spine, that somebody would say, the person that was giving the lecture at the time would say, look, what you're going to see next are going to be particularly gruesome images. You know, it's the equivalent of the grab yourself a stiff drink or brace yourself kind of thing. And on one occasion, I do remember somebody saying, look, this bit, you don't have to see this, right? If it's going to affect you and you want to stand outside, that's fine. Obviously, if you see something like this in a real job, you can't just go and stand outside. But for the sake of this lecture, you don't have to put yourself through it if you don't want to. Everybody remained, but that was a trigger warning. That is exactly what that was. And so if you can give a trigger warning in that kind of environment, then I don't see any reason why you should issue a carte blanche statement that trigger warnings will never be given in a university. Okay, so the 2 points that I really wanted to make with regard to this is that with regard to some of the more liberal universities in the United States and some of the things that have been taking place there, I suppose the most newsworthy of which was everything that went on at the University of Michigan, that went so far that led to the demanding of a racially segregated safe space. That one of the comments that was made, and it was quite an intelligent comment made, was that students, part of the reason that this is carrying on is because students are regarding themselves as customers, and you can understand that, especially in the United States where education costs so much, that effectively that's what students are. They are bringing a large sum of money to an educational establishment. They're effectively patronising an educational establishment with their money when they get a place at that educational establishment. And so they're not prepared to passively just sit and accept whatever the ethos is. They're saying, no, I'm paying this in. And like any customer, they start to feel entitled to make demands with regard to the product that they get and say, no, this service isn't good enough, right? I expect a little bit better than this. And of course, different people have different ideas of what is a good standard of service, and at some of these places, what's regarded as a good standard of service from some students are these safe spaces, are speakers that they oppose not being allowed on campus because they take offence at that speaker, or it makes them feel unsafe. I'm tempted to say whatever the hell that means, because it means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people, but it's a marvellous little term to throw in there, isn't it? Just to colour the conversation to your advantage. So there are people along that perspective, but this is the interesting thing, of course. There are many students who have entirely different views, and this runs across the political spectrum. This really isn't a left and right thing, regardless of how people may portray this. Okay, there are people demanding censorship and safe space ideology on the right, and there are people who are vigorously opposed to this on the left. In fact, the traditional perspective has been really the demand for intellectual freedom of speech has tended to come more from the liberal left than it has from anywhere else. So just very important to bear that in mind. But then you take all that into account and have another look at that University of Chicago letter, and I couldn't help thinking, part of it might be drawing an ideological line in the sand, nailing an ideological flag to the mast and saying, oh, this is where we stand, even if that means taking a slightly more hardline stance than is perhaps sensible, and perhaps more in the case of Chicago than where they're actually at. As one of the articles at the time pointed out, that in fact, at the same time that they're making their statement, the University of Chicago still support a whole number of support groups that function as safe spaces for students in different situations there. But you are going to have students who will be enticed by that kind of mentality at the University of Chicago and say, actually, that is what I want to give my patronage to. That is the kind of organization that I want to be a part of. That I don't really want to be a part of this safe space mentality in making a campus a safe space in terms of blocking and disbarring speakers because they have political opinions that some of the students find offensive. And bollocks to all of that. I'll set my store by people like the University of Chicago. So perhaps you're getting a little bit of a split here. Of course, there have always been splits in universities between different types of university in terms of their ethos. That happens in the United Kingdom the same as it does in the United States. But perhaps this is going to be a more divisive split than some of those other splits in terms of ethos. And it's kind of interesting to see where that goes. But it goes a stage further than this. And this is the bit that I found really interesting, because at the moment we're talking about the student as the customer, of course. But eventually a student leaves the university and goes into the real world that is somewhat more devoid of safe spaces, and then the student stops becoming the customer and the student starts becoming the product, and the employer is the customer. The employer is the person with the money to spend on the services, on the labour and on the intellectual abilities of the student. So the students have to start selling themselves. And of course, employers have always borne in mind what institution awarded you your degree. What university did you go and study at? And part of that has been, of course, the intellectual standards and rigour of the institution you studied at, of course. But also the ethos of the university has played a part in the minds of universities. But it seems to be getting a little bit more black and white now. So what I've been asking myself, and I'd encourage you to do the same, is then to place yourself, I suppose, in the position of an employer. And I know we could get bogged down into a conversation about what employers are entitled to take into account and what they're not. But we know, of course, that anybody who is employing people, especially if they're going to be working with them on a one-on-one basis, take a lot of things into account, not least, is this the kind of person that I want to be working with on a day-to-day basis? And people generally don't want to work with people that they think they might have to tread on eggshells around, that might be very, very easily offended. And whether that's right to take into account those things or wrong doesn't really matter. The fact is that is the realities of the world of employment. So what you effectively have, and I'm going to sort of caricature this a little bit, but employers do caricature it, is that you have two applicants, one of them from the University of Mollycoddlement and the other from the University of Hard Knocks. And how are you going to view those two products effectively that you potentially could purchase as an employer? Okay, and I think there's different levels that you can look at this. One, you can look at them as a product that's been spat out of that university, and you may well view the candidate who's come from the University of Hard Knocks as being a little bit more ready to be in the workplace because they're used to a slightly more robust environment. But perhaps more important than that, it's going to surely say something potentially about the mentality of that applicant as to the kinds of institutions that they applied for in the first place. And it may well be, even if you might be wrong in making this generalization, this stereotype, I still think it's going to be made by employers that you're going to view somebody who's applied and gone through the University of Mollycoddlement and thought, well, why have they gone for that kind of institution rather than somewhere that takes a stance like the University of Chicago? And that may well set alarm bells ringing. It may well set alarm bells ringing in two ways. The first is in terms of their basic functionality as an employee. Are things going to happen in the workplace that make this a terrible workplace for them to work, that they simply can't deal with it, they're off with stress, they've found something offensive and it's affecting their work, maybe something else has happened in their personal life and it's all just got too much for them. And these are the kind of things that employers fear, I should say, especially if you are a key or critical position, the kind of position where the whole workplace falls to pieces if you're absent sick for a month or so. And the second thing is, like I say, nobody wants to be working around somebody treading on eggshells. And the one thing that employers, I think, want less than anything is one of those dreaded employees that is just looking to find offence and looking to cause trouble. You know, there are some people, and we've all worked with them. Everybody has worked with them if you work for any number of years, and you know that they have trouble written all over them. They are the employee that is just looking to find something to pick a fight over, looking to find something offensive, looking to put a claim in, looking to get somebody into trouble for something that they've said. We've all worked with people like that, and you may well ask yourself, well, where is that person more likely to come from? Where is that person more likely to have applied for? Is it going to be the University of Mollycoddlement, or is it going to be the University of Hard Knocks? And so then we come back, do we not, to this whole point of the free market and customers, the student as a customer choosing where to put their money and then feeling entitled to have their say. Well, they do, but then this is something that students are going to have to function, perhaps. This is what I'm proposing in their decision making, is that if they plump for one of these very safe space oriented universities, they may have to take into account how that decision is viewed down the line by potential employers. Okay, that was a point that I not heard anybody else make. I don't know how far society will go in that direction. I think it depends how polarized this remains and for how long. How long will this remain this polarized? I don't know. I remember back in 2012 when all the Atheism Plus thing kicked off, thinking, well, this won't last very long, and we're now 5 years later and things have only gotten deeper. The rifts have only gotten deeper. So let's see where this goes. I think this might be one to watch with regard to universities and this particular schism. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.